On the first day he arrived in New York, Adrian made a decision that sounded insane even to himself. For 30 days he would not speak. Not to strangers. Not to cashiers. Not to neighbors. Not to anyone. No voice. No explanations. No small talk. No sorry. No thank you. No I'm fine. Only silence. In a city built on noise, speed, and constant self-announcement, he wanted to disappear without leaving. At first, he told himself it was a social experiment. He wanted to observe people, to understand how much of life was performance, how much communication was real, how much of human connection survived once words were removed. But deep down there was another reason, one he did not want to name, because sometimes people don't go silent to study the world. Sometimes they go silent because they no longer know what to say to themselves. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a narrow brick building in Queens. Small, clean enough. A bed, a chair, a table by the window, and a radiator that clanged like it was arguing with the wall. From the window, Adrian could see a restless street below, delivery bikes, women dragging grocery carts, a man selling fruit from wooden crates, teenagers laughing too loudly, sirens in the distance, music from a passing car, the constant roar of the city refusing to pause for anyone. New York did not feel like a place. It felt like a current. You either moved with it or got dragged under. Adrian stood by the window with his suitcase still unopened and slipped a folded card into his coat pocket. On it, in clean black letters, he had written, "I'm not speaking this month. Thank you for your patience." Underneath, in smaller text, "I can still hear you." He looked at the card for a long time. Then he put it away. And just like that, the experiment began. The first person to test him was the owner of the corner deli, a tired-looking man in his 50s, with thick eyebrows and the energy of someone who had seen every type of customer and had already lost interest in most of them. Adrian walked in on his first morning and pointed at a coffee and a sesame bagel. The man asked, "Cream cheese?" Adrian nodded. "Toasted?" Another nod. "You got words or just vibes today?" Adrian reached into his pocket and handed him the card. The man read it, looked up, read it again, then smirked. "New York got all kinds." He handed the card back, prepared the order, and slid the coffee across the counter. When Adrian paid, the man said, "Good luck with whatever this is." Adrian smiled but said nothing, and that became the pattern. Raised eyebrows, amusement, confusion, occasional irritation. Most people accepted silence only if it was temporary, accidental, or explained by weakness. Silence as a choice made them uncomfortable, especially in a city where everyone seemed to believe that if you were not speaking, you were losing. By the 3rd day, Adrian began to notice something strange. People filled silence immediately, not because it was needed, but because they feared it. A cashier would ask a question, then answer it herself before he could even point. A man in an elevator once said, "Cold today," then added, "Well, I guess that's winter," then laughed alone, as if silence itself had accused him of being awkward. Even on the subway, where nobody looked at each other, there was still noise. Phones playing videos without headphones, arguments at one end of the car, someone preaching about salvation, someone else cursing under his breath, laughter, announcements, brakes screaming. There was always something between people and themselves. Adrian started to suspect that words were not always used to connect. Sometimes they were used to avoid contact, not with others, with the self. His notebook became his voice. Every evening he sat by the window and wrote what he had seen. Not just events, patterns. A woman in expensive heels crying quietly while texting with one hand and eating salad with the other on a park bench. 2 brothers arguing outside a laundromat, then hugging awkwardly 5 minutes later. A homeless man speaking more gently to a stray cat than most people spoke to each other. A couple at a restaurant spending an entire meal on their phones, speaking only once when the bill arrived. A little girl in a red coat who smiled at every person she passed, even though almost no one smiled back. The city was full of voices, but not much listening. The more Adrian said nothing, the more he began to hear everything. Tone, hesitation, fatigue, loneliness disguised as confidence, fear disguised as speed, desperation hidden under polished language. It turned out words carried meaning, but silence revealed intention. On the 6th day, he met Mara. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that turns crosswalks into mirrors and makes the whole city look briefly cinematic. He was standing under the awning of a bookstore in Manhattan when she stepped beside him, shaking out a black umbrella. She looked at him once, then at the notebook in his hand. "You waiting for the rain to stop?" she asked, "or writing a novel about it?" Adrian smiled faintly but said nothing. She studied his face. "Oh," she said. "You're one of those." He raised an eyebrow. "One of those people who say more by not talking than the rest of us do by talking too much." He reached into his pocket and showed her the card. She read it and laughed softly. "For a month? That's either brilliant or a sign you need professional help." He almost laughed too. Instead, he tucked the card away. She leaned against the wall and looked out at the rain. "You know," she said, "most people come to New York because they want to be heard." He looked at her. She added, "You might be the first one who came here to disappear." The rain fell harder. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she said, "I'm Mara." He nodded once. "I assume silence means no names too?" He shook his head, took out the notebook and wrote, "Adrian." She read it. "Nice to meet you, Adrian, who doesn't speak." Then she pointed to the bookstore behind them. "I work there. If you're going to stand outside dramatically every time it rains, at least come in and pretend you read difficult books." She opened the door and disappeared inside. Adrian followed. Mara had the kind of face that did not hide what it thought. Sharp eyes, tired humor, dark hair usually tied back carelessly. She moved quickly but not nervously, like a person who had learned to survive her own thoughts by staying in motion. The bookstore was narrow and warm, with old wood floors and the smell of paper and dust. It became the first place in the city where Adrian felt less like an observer and more like a presence. He started going there almost every afternoon. He would browse, write, sit near the back. Mara would talk while shelving books, recommending novels he could not discuss out loud. At first their communication was uneven. She spoke. He wrote, sometimes only a word, sometimes whole sentences, sometimes just expressions. But something unusual happened. Without voice there was no rush, no need to reply instantly, no pressure to impress, no performance. Their silences were not empty. They were shared, and that, Adrian realized, was rare. On the 9th day, Mara asked him the question everyone else seemed too polite or too disinterested to ask. "Why are you doing this?" Adrian looked at her from across the small reading table. He could have written the easy answer. Social experiment. That was the official version. The intelligent version. The version that made it sound controlled. Instead, he wrote, "I wanted to see what people sound like when I stop interrupting the world with myself." Mara read it slowly, then sat down. "That's not the whole reason." He looked away. She waited. That was another thing about her. She knew how to leave space without rushing to fill it. Finally, Adrian wrote again, this time slower. "I think I got tired of hearing myself say things I didn't mean." Mara read the line and didn't respond right away. Then she said quietly, "That sounds less like an experiment and more like exhaustion." He didn't argue, because she was right. Before New York, Adrian had worked in marketing in London. Good salary, sharp suits, predictable meetings, endless language. He wrote campaigns for brands that spoke confidently about authenticity, community, identity, and purpose. Most of it was polished nonsense. He knew it. They knew it. Everyone knew it. But language paid well when used correctly. He became very good at saying what people wanted to hear. To clients, to colleagues, to women he dated, to his parents, to himself. I'm doing well. I'm just tired. It's only stress. This is temporary. I know what I'm doing. Eventually he noticed something unsettling. The better he became at speaking, the less honest he felt. His life was full of language and empty of truth. Then one night, after leaving a work dinner where everyone had laughed too hard and lied too smoothly, he went home, looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, and felt a strange internal silence, not peace, absence. As if the person inside him had stepped back and stopped participating. 3 weeks later, he quit his job. 2 months later, he rented the apartment in Queens. And on the first day in New York, he chose silence. Not to become mysterious, not to prove anything, but because speech had started to feel like betrayal. By the second week, the city changed shape. Or maybe Adrian did. He began noticing how differently people treated him once they realized he would not speak. Some became kinder. A waitress in a diner started bringing him tea without asking after, seeing his card twice. An old woman in the park sat beside him every Thursday and fed pigeons, telling him stories about her late husband with no expectation of response. A barber in Brooklyn gave him one of the best haircuts of his life and simply said at the end, "Sometimes quiet people are easier to trust," but others reacted with hostility. A man at a subway station snapped, "Use your words, man," when Adrian pointed toward a train map. Another rolled his eyes and muttered, "Everyone wants to be special." That interested him. Silence seemed to act like a mirror. People projected onto it whatever they carried. Patience, suspicion, tenderness, contempt. The less he said, the more visible others became. Yet the real surprise was not what he learned about strangers. It was what silence revealed inside him. At first, the absence of speech felt powerful, clean, disciplined. Then it became uncomfortable. Without talking, there were no verbal escapes, no jokes to deflect, no stories to control how he appeared, no fast answers to avoid difficult thought. Old memories surfaced. His father at the dinner table, asking practical questions and never emotional ones. A former girlfriend once telling him, "You always say the right thing, Adrian. I just don't know if you feel any of it." The moment he received a promotion at work and felt absolutely nothing except fatigue. The funeral of his mother, where he delivered a composed, eloquent speech and couldn't remember a word of it afterward. He had spent years using language like architecture, building structures, managing impressions, designing himself in ways that sounded convincing. But silence tore down the scaffolding, and underneath it, he found a man more lonely than he had admitted. On the 17th day, he and Mara walked across the Brooklyn Bridge at dusk. The sky was pale blue, turning silver, the river below cold and metallic. Tourists took photos. Runners moved around them impatiently. The city glowed ahead like a machine made of glass and hunger. Mara held a paper cup of coffee in both hands. "You know what I think?" she said. Adrian looked at her. "I think most people talk because they want control." He tilted his head. "Not just over conversation," she said. "Over perception. If they keep speaking, they can shape what things mean before reality has the chance." He took out the notebook. "And silence?" She read and answered immediately. "Silence is dangerous. Silence lets things be what they are." They kept walking. After a while, she added, "That's why people fear it. Silence doesn't flatter." He wrote, "Do you?" She took longer this time, then said, "Yes." A few steps later, But I trust it more than performance. That sentence stayed with him all night. In the third week, the experiment began attracting attention he had never intended. A man in the bookstore overheard Mara explaining the card and asked if Adrian was doing some kind of art project. A student asked to photograph the note for a social media post about intentional living. Someone on the subway called him that silent guy, as if he were already becoming a type. Adrian hated it. He had not come to New York to become an idea. He had come because he had run out of faith in his own voice. But even silence, he realized, could be commodified, made into identity, made into spectacle, made into content. The city had a talent for turning every private struggle into a public style. That night he almost ended the experiment. He sat on the edge of his bed, card in one hand, notebook in the other, and thought about speaking the next morning. Just one sentence, anything, to prove he still could. But then he asked himself a better question. Not can I speak, but why am I so eager to return to noise? The room gave no answer, only radiator clanging and distant sirens, so he stayed silent. On the 24th day, Mara was quieter than usual. He noticed it immediately. She was shelving returns too carefully, not looking at him directly. When they closed the bookstore that evening, she sat on the floor behind the counter and said, "My father called." Adrian sat across from her. "He does that every few months," she continued. "Usually because he feels guilty, or lonely, or old. Hard to tell which." She laughed once, bitterly. "Anyway, he said he doesn't understand why I never tell him anything real." She looked at Adrian then. "The truth is, I stopped telling him things because every time I tried growing up, he turned it into advice." She folded her arms over her knees. Some people listen just long enough to prepare their reply. Adrian wrote one line. "That's not listening." She nodded. "No, it's waiting." The bookstore was silent after that, but not awkwardly. More like a wound being acknowledged. Before leaving, she said, "I think that's why being around you is easy." He looked at her. She smiled faintly. "You can't interrupt." The final week arrived almost without warning. 30 days had once felt abstract, almost theatrical. Now the end of silence felt intimate, fragile. He started wondering what his first spoken words should be. Something profound, something honest, something simple. He rejected every version. The truth was, the experiment had changed its meaning. It had begun as distance. It ended as confrontation. He had come to observe the world without language. Instead, he had discovered how often language protects people from truth. How often noise disguises fear. How often the deepest communication happens before words arrive, or after they fail. He also understood something harder. Silence had not healed him, but it had stripped away some of the falsehood, and sometimes that is the beginning of healing. Not feeling better, just becoming less divided. On the 30th day, he returned to the bookstore early. Mara was making tea in the back room. When she saw him, she smiled. "So," she said, "today's the day." He nodded. "Nervous?" "A little." She handed him a cup. They sat across from each other at the same small reading table, where he had once written answers to her questions. Rain touched the windows lightly. The store was still closed. No customers, no music, just paper, weather, and waiting. Mara leaned back. "What are you going to say first?" Adrian looked at her for a long moment. He had imagined this scene many times. He thought maybe the first words would feel ceremonial, important. Instead, they felt heavy, not because speaking was difficult, but because he now understood its cost. Finally, he inhaled. His voice came out rough, lower than he remembered. "Thank you." Mara held his gaze, then smiled, but her eyes changed slightly at the sound of him. "For what?" Adrian swallowed. "For not asking me to be louder than I was." The room stayed still. Mara looked down into her tea and said quietly, That might be the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me in this store. He almost smiled. Then he added, I thought silence would teach me about other people. And it taught me how much of my life was noise. Mara nodded slowly. That sounds about right for New York. He laughed then. A real laugh. Small but real. The first one in a month that made sound. Later that evening, Adrian walked back through the city alone. Nothing outside had changed. Sirens still cut through the streets. Restaurants spilled conversation onto sidewalks. Subway grates breathed heat into the cold air. The city remained itself, restless, loud, impossible. But he no longer heard it the same way. He understood now that silence was not merely the absence of speech. It was attention. It was restraint. It was the refusal to drown truth in performance. And maybe that was the real language he had come to learn. Not how to live without words, but how to stop using words to hide. He paused outside his building and looked up at the lit windows stacked above the street like separate lives. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to explain himself to anyone. Not to strangers, not to the city, not even fully to himself. Some truths did not arrive as declarations. They arrived as quiet recognition, the kind you could only hear once everything unnecessary had gone silent. He came to New York to disappear into silence. Instead, silence returned him to himself.